Like I said, probably been here working on the garden properly for about 5 years. And so what you see is mostly no more than 5 years old. And the garden is about an acre in total, quite long and thin. And I'm going to talk quickly about 3 parts of it. The front garden, which is more formal in its outline, quite small relatively. And then the back garden by the house, which is quite structured. And then really further away, the further away you get, it gets wilder and wilder and less intervention. And Noel, I want to finish off by a little bit of the garden that was directly inspired by you and your reasons for maybe moving somewhere else. I'm going to kick off with the front garden. And this is the garden after I'd re-landscaped it. When we moved in, it was completely neglected, overgrown, and sloping up to the house, really a pile of rubble. So I spent probably 1 or 2 very back-breaking winters terracing it and leveling it out like this. The whole garden is steeply sloping and is north-facing, and there's very few flat areas. So this partly involved making a flat area. A formal straight front path to the front door, a bit of lawn to the left, and then narrow beds about 60 centimetres, 2 feet wide on each side. I guess the theme for a lot of this, the garden, is that I always want there to be more stories and more messages and more things of interest in the garden than just it looking nice or pretty or beautiful. So this is also a rain garden. So I designed it to take the rainwater off the roof and off the pavement, the path. So the planting in the strips alongside the main path, these are slightly sunken swales, which is a fancy name for a ditch, basically. And there's a bigger area of rain garden, which is sunken down. And from the house, the downpipes and the gutters, they feed down through into the garden. So when it rains, the water from the roof goes down into the garden. So this is a whole new opportunity for trying out a range of plants to suit this situation. So this is just after planting, and maybe it's possible to see the swale areas on each side of the path are slightly sunken. And one of the downpipes from the roof empties first into this pond, which can then overspill into the garden. So these images are from about 5 years ago. This is me doing a very scary thing of cutting off the downpipe and feeding it into the garden, which is, I tell you, it is a very scary thing to do. It feels scary anyway, with a few drain pipe extensions and then feeding into the garden. And I don't know if you can see this, but it seems very difficult to remember this now, but this is just 5 weeks ago, or 6 weeks ago, when we were in the middle of the endless rainstorms. Now, I took these photos this morning, so this is how it looks now after about 5 years, looking along the front path. And I'm not going to talk any more about the rain garden side. I really want to talk about the planting here because it's an example of layering in planting. And what I really want to do is to get the maximum value out of the same bit of space, the same square meter, from spring right the way through to the winter. Without having to do very much in between. So it's a whole series of plants push up through one after the other. And like I said, it's a relatively small space. And I wanted to show here that naturalistic planting doesn't just have to fill whole fields. It can work in small spaces. But my solution to working in a small space is to go up. So I'm not afraid of tall plants in small spaces. What you can see here are primulas from the spring, and these leek-like things. This is the foliage of Allium Mount Everest, which does look like leeks coming up at the moment. In a few weeks' time, this will all be submerged in the foliage of the perennials coming through. So this is from May of last year, so 4 weeks forward in time, if you like. And that early spring layer is pretty much submerged. And here I've got cultivars of Iris sibirica. I can see white ragged robin, white camassias as part of the layer here for early to mid-May. Now on the left, where I had the area of lawn, that bit of lawn was just so small and fiddly, it wasn't even worth bothering with. So I've converted it into a meadow by using the William Robinson technique of planting perennials directly into the turf. A lot of Iris sibirica and hardy geraniums. And you can see some of those flowering behind there. So this is end of May, middle of May, with the white alliums, if you peer in, the leek-like things now in flower. Looking down into the garden, and I guess it's amazing to me just see the change. It's been a really nice experience putting these slides together, just to have a look at the change over time. So this is into May. I'm going to move forward, looking through that. With Geranium sylvaticum and Iris sibirica and persicarias. A whole new layer coming through. I can see allium seed heads, I can see Ligularia, the rocket, and I can see a stilbe in bud. This is a stilbe purple lance. So this is probably 2 months from now. And then moving on a few weeks, that's the stilbe flowering with the Ligularia just going over. I can see some purple loosestrife in there and pale lemon Camericallis. I've got grasses in there as well. This is Miscanthus Giganteus, which is like a huge, well-behaved bamboo, which comes up each year to about 3 meters. I guess a big mistake, well, I know for me, these red crocosmias, which I'm going to be taking out, I really don't like them in there. Moving on a bit, the stilbe is fading and Rudbeckias and orange and yellow crocosmias taking over. So this is coming into August now with blue Devil's Bit scabious at the lower level spilling over the path. And now into September with asters and Rudbeckias and the stilbe seed heads and the Miscanthus grass. There, and this is December and through into January. So that's a really quick spin through of how I really work and how I think of maximizing the amount of value from each square meter. Now moving to behind the house, this is a really steeply sloping garden, and I've gone completely OCD with log piles because I had a lot of wood available from chopping down a lot of sycamores which had invaded the garden. I find myself unable to stop making these log piles. And what I really like are these satisfying humpback forms. Because it's sloping upwards, I really position them one behind the other, so as you move through, there's always a change. And just like a hedge, because these are structural elements, they do need maintenance. Each year I top them up with smaller wood to maintain the shape. These are not fixed in any way, they're just stacked up. And the trick really is to use a whole range of sizes with smaller ones on top. And really not to go much higher than a meter to my cost, I found, going much higher than a meter ends up in disaster. Paths and deckways running through form a permanent structure through the garden and gradually become more and more engulfed with the naturalistic perennials and grasses which fill the space in between. So this is July, early July, with Campanula laudanana there, one of my favorite early summer flowering plants. This is from last summer. I did the Chelsea chop on the companions, which made them a lot more manageable. I just throw in here that within naturalistic plantings, I do like to work with colour. It's kind of unfashionable, really, to talk about colour with naturalistic plantings, but with it because I think it does take it to a different level. And I like to work at the moment a lot with lavenders and pinks and mauves and purples with some white thrown in. So it's Phlox hesperis with God, the problem is my mind starts to go blank. So this is a September, late August, September. So as the summer goes on, the grass perennials get taller and taller and the log piles disappear. And as with most people working in this way, I do like to leave the perennials and the grasses standing for as long as I possibly can, because as well as the visual side of things, I think these are really good habitat. There's a lot of shelter for invertebrates in here. There's a lot of seed for birds. And this is how it looks now. So all the seed heads have come down, but I work quite a lot with wintergreen perennials as well in naturalistic planting, such as these euphorbias, to still retain some freshness and vitality through the winter months. So it's not just all brown. Now, moving as far away from the house as you can get, the old quarry, which this was this was an old quarry before I made the garden. It was an abandoned quarry. Really lucky to have a bit of oak woodland, which had become infested with sycamores, which is where all the wood comes from. But it's a natural bluebell wood, and so I really didn't want to do very much horticultural embellishment. These daffodils were here already, and all I've done is with my compulsiveness, built more log piles in it. Oh, sorry, a bit out of sequence here. And all I've really wanted to do here is to make a sense of space and structure. Again, surprise, surprise, with logs. But I've simply made a circle here with a circular seat, which my father made, which is quite special to me. Sat off center, and that's pretty much it. Now in this time of year, there are some daffodils, there's a nice lot of self-seeded holly. But all the green you see there is not really grass, it's the foliage of the bluebells, which will come up and flower really in a few weeks' time, right the way through May. And flower really in a few weeks' time, right the way through May. So this is ever changing, and that seed becomes submerged, the logs become submerged. And really, I think it's just an example to me of non-intervention, of not wanting to do lots of wonderful things with plants and horticulture, but to really work with what's there. And I manage all this by lawnmower. So with a rotary mower, I go through it all in probably August when all the seed has fallen from the bluebells. Go over the whole thing once, and that's it until the following year. Now, just to finish off, Noel, I said I'd come back to your inspiration. I think one of the reasons that you wanted to try pastures new is because you became tired of battling with weeds and with grasses in the winter and things becoming infested with difficult to remove weeds. And I guess I've tried to work with that idea and gone a little bit more towards the rewilding approach for a lot of the garden. And rather than trying to battle with everything that's there, I'm working as much as I can with it and then planting into it. So it's a hybrid really between studied plantings and complete rewilding. So I don't know if you can see in this image here, this is an area of lawn. On the left, it's still fresh and green. I took this morning of the original lawn, and on the right is the old lawn that I planted into in the Robinsonian style, and now I manage it as a meadow. And if you look closely, I can see leucanthemums and geraniums and persicarias. And I do that simply by planting in pot-grown perennials at about this sort of distance. At about this sort of distance, probably about 2 feet apart. This is something I'm doing now. This is geranium and full card, which is a bit of a thug in a border. It just goes everywhere, but I think in a meadow situation, it'll weave its way amongst the grasses really nicely. So this is that rewilded meadow last summer with planted in geraniums, but also thistles and sorrel, which was in the grassland anyway. And I really like the contrast between a simple mown circle and then the taller grasses around it. So here's some of the embellishment. With geranium, Silas Demon. And then a little bit later on, I planted in hybrid leucanthemums. This is a hybrid called Becky, which is quite a tall one, but it flowers later than the oxeye daisies. It goes on and on and on. There's a white thalictrum I can see in there. And lots of roseberry willow herb, which I really like. And it's growing up amongst the tall herb community there. And I think to me, this is something I'm finding really exciting, to play around between this mix between complete non-intervention and more planted borders to go with this wild approach. And this is at the end of the year with Persicaria, Amplex, the Elba, which flowers right the way through into November. And I cut this all back in January, and then it starts again. So that's a quick tour from me around different parts of my garden. And I will now try and get out of it for you, Noel. There you are.
This is my former garden in Herefordshire, the Welsh borders near Hale and Wye. It's on old red sandstone, so it's a pretty rich soil, very high nutrients, in fact, particularly high in phosphorus. So we had, very, very strong plant growth. Of course, that also means very high weed growth. It was also pretty wet, up to 1,500 millimeters a year. It's on enough of a slope to most of it to have drained, but the soil did hang on to water, so it was providing really very, very good growing conditions, which meant that a lot of herbaceous perennials did grow incredibly well, but I was always up against this major problem with weed growth, particularly aggressive pasture grasses. So we're looking down from the house in late May, and I was saying about major weed problems. Of course, weeds always segue into spontaneous wildflowers. And with the cow parsley, I adopted a policy which was a kind of managed toleration. But cow parsley, we see it absolutely everywhere, so we think, oh gosh, this is a really competitive plant. In fact, it isn't. Cow parsley is extremely narrow. It essentially becomes dormant from July onwards. And so, in fact, although it seems to get everywhere, it's not particularly competitive. And so we allowed quite a bit of it to grow, and tend to hoik it out once it had finished flowering in order to reduce seeding, which seemed to keep it within bounds. And personally, I really This is my former garden in Herefordshire, the Welsh borders, near Hay-on-Wye. It's on old red sandstone, so this is really from a similar viewpoint. We're looking back up towards the house, and indeed the various buttercups play quite a role here. In the front, Filipendula camschatense from the Russian Far East and Hokkaido in northern Japan. And I know we've got Sachi here from Hokkaido, who's probably thinks I'm completely mad to put this in a garden. This is the meadowsweet that grows to kind of 2 meters or so. With us, it's spread only fairly slowly, and I felt this played a very, very important visual role. That kind of chunky graphic foliage. So this was looking towards the straw clay building, which I used as an office, and we also had a guest accommodation there. And a little green roof on the left-hand side. This looks rather wonderful, but this area, quite frankly, was always a nightmare to manage. Very heavy soil, that sort of subsoil really, that a lot of things didn't really establish well in. Geranium pratense and Nautia macedonica, and to some extent Salvia foscauli, were able to self-seed very successfully. They never kind of mingled. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd have this wonderful blue-red mix of the Nautia and the geranium and the salvia, but they never quite kind of really meshed together. And the season for this was relatively short. The Aquileia vulgaris varieties here, quite a strong presence, various euphorbias, Phlomis russelliana in front there. Very much emphasis on the 5% plant formers, but for me, the self-seeders like the Aquileia were really very, very important as well. And I'm going to differ with Nigel on the clump issue, as we shall see. A bit of a close-up there. Oh yes, now Trolleus europaeus, bottom left-hand corner. Going Going lower down, this was an area we called the Wild Garden, which was a kind of a good example of serendipity, really, because it started off very much as a dumping ground for quantities of things which I didn't quite know what to do. I had more than I wanted and didn't quite know what to do with, and for the most part, pretty robust plants. And very soon, we had this very good mix of plants, perhaps a fairly limited range of species, but all very strong growers that mesh together and occupy space very effectively. So Iris sibirica in the centre there, Persicara distortus superbum, the Aquiledias again, Geranium sylvaticum, Geranium phaeum as well on the left, various cultivars of Geranium phaeum, which very successful mainland European plant, but in fact has naturalised in parts of Britain. You know, very, very useful, we find, for these maritime climates, because they make a very early leaf growth, so therefore a very good competitor with weeds. A little bit later on, various blue geraniums here. The wispy thing at height is Thalictrum ellin, which was something I discovered about sort of halfway through my tenure of this garden. Something that will produce flowers at that kind of height, at that kind of 2 meter height in June, is there's not many things that will do that. And Thalictrum very successfully. And once it's finished flowering, it becomes almost invisible. Now, Nigel was talking about relying on clump formers. I rather came to the opposite conclusion, that clump formers are great, but to have other plants that fill in the gaps between clump formers adds another whole dimension, and it's just another way of helping fill space. And the bronzy foliage there of Leucamachia ciliata firecracker, I found, in fact, to be very useful. This is one of those plants that, you know, if you can't eavesdrop at a hardy plant society plant sale, there's always somebody grumbling about it. Oh, I pulled out of my garden and now it's absolutely everywhere. Well, yes, it fills in the gaps. It never penetrated clumps. I just found it incredibly useful for running around and filling in the clumps between things like geraniums and asters, and adding that touch of bronze, particularly early in the year, was really very useful. So July here, we've got the Filipendula, another Japanese Filipendula yedoensis there on the left, and indeed another Filipendula, the American Filipendula rubra on the right. And much of the garden was about this kind of sense of immersiveness. So you have very narrow paths, big perennials, and this bamboo. So this strong sense of being immersed in powerful vegetation. A bit later on, August, September, the lush soil really comes to the fore. Persicaria amplexicaulis, we found an incredibly useful plant, very, very long flowering season, forming this sort of big, bulky masses, which were very good for filling space. The umbella for here is another wild one, which we just came in from the woods, and we never even really tried or needed to manage it. The annual Angelica sylvestris, an attractive plant in its own right, not big enough to be competitive, and which was always a very welcome addition. The blue at the front is Gentiana asclepiada, the alpine willow gentian, which does pretty well on clay soils, but we found one of those things that takes a few years to establish, and you had to rather sort of defend it against everything else before it was really able to hold its own. A nice example of something that benefited, I think, enormously from the high productivity of this soil. I remember having Jonas Reif, when he was editor of Garden Praxis, the German garden magazine, came for lunch one day, and he was absolutely astonished at the size of it. Well, I've since been to Scotland and seen this thing at 1.2 metres in the north of Scotland. So one of these big plants in full bloom flower is quite something. As much as anyone else, I'm in love with these prairie plants, the various Joe Pye weeds, up to 3.5 metres, Helianthus lemon queen, kind of enormous rambunctious mixes of plants, fantastic butterfly plants. And for the most part, the sheer scale of these things means that they are pretty weed proof. Other areas, I didn't intentionally tend to major on hollyhocks, but they self-seeded so well, and always just love that amazing range of colours, and particularly useful for later in the year. And on our fairly moist soil, they would often carry on flowering well into September. Rudbeckia fulgida at the front, and Echinacea Purpurea, which is one of those perennials that has had a long reputation for being relatively unreliable or short-lived, and I've had many discussions as to quite why this is. And for me, these plants will live there for at least 5 years in fairly competitive conditions. I'm not quite sure what I was doing right, but so they can be fairly persistent, although I know that a lot of people do find them quite unreliable. As we got lower down, we got to the point where we actually hit the water table, and we had a pond, which, as you can see, fills up with this delicious looking green slime. The yellow is another one of the local wildflowers, which has a very strongly running habit, which in this area we basically thought, well, just welcome it and see what we can do with it. The fleabane, Polycaria dicentrica, and the blue is Aster puniceus, which is a North American aster that used to be in cultivation, not really anymore. I mean, this was seed out wild collected in the Catskills. An aster that self-seeds really quite strongly, but doesn't spread vegetatively, and was a really nice one, just a really good wild garden plant in that it self-sowed to a responsible level, and flower over a nice long kind of August through to September period. Suchisa pratensis, another, the devil's bit scabious, another very butterfly-friendly wildflower of the local area we brought into the garden. And on the left, that is actually the wild angelica. So again, that's another spontaneous element. Now, I mentioned and have complained about weeds. The part of the garden where I hardly had any weeding to do was this experimental plot, which I laid out. I couldn't tell you offhand the year, but this was a trial that lasted for a full 7 years. And I'm just going to talk about it very briefly. I might, in fact, do a webinar based around this at a later date. But basically, I set out 8 of these blocks with the identical, but with changing various ornamental grass components. Basically, this was very dense planting. So by March, we had something like this. So really good ground coverage, really effective intermeshing vegetation that was very effectively suppressing weeds. And this you could see, you can immediately recognize a couple of Nigel's beloved clump formers, Geraniums phaeum, but look at the Phlovis russelliana, those much bigger heart-shaped leaves. Look at how that's actually filling in quite a bit of space. Later on, by May, Geranium sylvaticum was flowering, and we had this very tightly meshed set of vegetation that was occupying space at pretty well all levels. The final year, we did a survey, and anyone who came to visit got sort of kidnapped and volunteered down to help do some surveying. So every plant in every 10 centimetre square was identified. So every plant in every 10 centimetre square was identified and you can pop them on an Excel spreadsheet and give them all a different color and create these very graphic charts, which are basically showing you where plants have moved to over that 7-year period. So every plant in every 10 centimetre square was identified, and you can pop them on an Excel spreadsheet and give them all a different color and create these very graphic charts, which are basically showing you where plants have moved to over that 7-year period. And you can do an overlay to show you exactly where they began. So the Phlomis Russelliana started off in the middle and then spread to all the squares with the dark green. And I think what this showed very clearly was that each one of the 8 squares had very different outcomes. But there was a consistency, and one of the levels of consistency was to show this gradient between the clump formers, like the bright yellow here, which is Solidago rugosa, and things like the Phlomis, which was the dark green, or Geranium phaeum, which are dark blue, which we tend to think of both of these plants as quite good solid clump formers, but put them in a situation where they face competition and their performance then becomes more like gap fillers. So this ability to move around and fill space and mesh in between other plants created what was actually a very effective minimum weeding situation. And this part of the garden, quite honestly, took hardly any time and maintenance whatsoever. And it convinced me that this model of fairly dense planting, which of course is based on the whole German model of mixed planting, was potentially a very successful one for the British landscape and climate, where we have this very long growing seasons, a very weed-friendly climate, and this Herefordshire garden with its very high soil fertility was a good place to test this basic concept.